I've inserted a little Q&A here to lead us into sort of the final portion of our webinar, which is about the manager's responsibility. And the question that came in essentially was, is burnout indicative of an organizational problem versus individual one? Or is burnout and the subsequent recovery from burnout the responsibility of the employee? My short answer is that any substantive and permanent change will have to be made at the organization level. So, in order for any difference to occur, in order for burnout to stop happening or lessen, that is the organization's responsibility because it's the organization's problem. Burnout is what happens to employees in an unhealthy work environment. It is not on the employee in terms of whether or not it happened to them. That is not their responsibility. To some degree, it is on each of us to try and get better, but more so that responsibility should reside with the organization. So, what should managers do? If you are a manager in any capacity, please pay attention to this section. If you are not a manager in any capacity and have a manager, maybe sort of suggest this webinar starting at this specific timestamp to give them some helpful information. So, in this relationship, you are the one in control and you have some degree of power or influence on this whole burnout situation. It is your responsibility as a manager to work with the administration, that higher leadership level, to address the areas that are creating burnout. What does that look like? What can you do? As a manager, be observant, perform an informal assessment of your staff. How are they doing? If you received a link to this webinar and you're in the GLAM field, your staff are not doing well. Take a human first approach and center all analysis and decisions on the well-being of your staff. I do not want you to bring in the strategic plan. I do not want you to refer to HR policies when you're working on this. You need to center the staff and their needs first, and then change the HR policies, update the organizational priorities because it needs to be human first. Next, I want you to advocate for realistic workloads and more resources. So I want you to communicate up what is or is not going to happen because what is or is not realistic. And I want you to communicate up what resources you need in order to make all the other things happen. And I want you to communicate down to your staff what is reasonable and help them with forming what is reasonable and how they can be successful with a reasonable workload. Next, I do not want you to perpetuate unrealistic expectations, workloads, or other toxic behaviors that manipulate or gaslight employees into sacrificing more of themselves for the greater good. For examples, you can refer earlier to this webinar, but essentially, you cannot be the one making and doing and affecting this toxic behavior. So knock it off. Next, set your staff up for success by providing regular, constructive, and positive feedback. Like, it doesn't have to be positive all the time, but if it's not, it needs to be constructive. And when it's constructive, what that looks like is actual specific requests, advice, or examples of what is successful. It's not just a critique or criticism with no ability or no detail on how the worker can be successful. Also, as much as constructive criticism can help your employees become better, so can positive reinforcement and affirmation of what they are doing correct and successfully. So please use both. To continue, Help staff find the ways that they work best and actively support them in areas where they are struggling with tangible solutions and better resources. So, if there are areas where your staff are struggling, where there's a bit of a gap in expertise or skill, whatever it is, help them on an individual basis because everybody is going to be different in what works for their brains. Next, prevent any shit from hitting staff to the fullest extent possible. That is your job. That is why you are being paid more to some extent. And none of this should be hitting your staff in any impactful way. If there is something that needs to change at the staff level, that is something that you can provide in a constructive fashion. And none of this should be hitting them directly. Recognize that you are the one that sets the tone for the team on what is or is not tolerated, and you need to adopt a zero tolerance policy for any toxic behavior, both within and toward your staff. That is your responsibility. Also, push for meaningful policy creation or change that centers the staff's well-being. You are in a position of power and influence. You are the only one who can advocate for that effectively for your staff. Which, of course, advocate for reasonable accommodations, better pay, better benefits, better anything for your staff. That is the other part of your job, is to help make sure that your staff are set up for success, that they are being treated and compensated well, and that they're doing well as human beings. That is your job. So, if we were to boil this down, and as you go through this work as a manager, it boils down to two questions. One, what structural, so organizational change, can you make? Two, how can you take better care of your people?